My name is Aneta Jerska, and I'm the coordinator of European Coordination of Committees and Associations for Palestine. And I'm acting as a moderator of today's webinar that is being organized by World Without Walls Europe and Stop the Wall. We have translation provided into Spanish. So if you would like to hear translation, please just click the interpretation icon on the Zoom link and you will have the translation. We'll be 5 great speakers today, and we are joined by Wendela De Vries from Stop Wapenhandel, Brigitte Espuche from Migre Europe, Amal Advan from Legal Center in Lesbos, Chloe Haralambush from Sea-Watch, and Raya Alsana from Who Profits. After all the speakers have spoken, we have time for questions and answers that you can add through the chat box function in the comments. Before we start and before we give the floor to the speakers, just a reminder that, as we know very well, the European militarization and anti-immigration policies have increased recently since the past couple of years, and they are very much being influenced by Israeli policies and by the usage of Israeli technology. The most recent example is the fact that the European agencies, Frontex and EMSA, European Maritime Safety Agency, are using Israeli drones in the Mediterranean Sea. So as on the one hand, we have the situation where after 10,000 European citizens signed petition to EMSA, that EMSA didn't prolong the contract with Elbit. On the other hand, we have a situation where Frontex just announced a new contract signing with Israeli aerospace industry and Elbit systems. So for refugees, of course, that are trying to cross Mediterranean Sea, it will have very devastating consequences. We'll be discussing all of this today at today's webinar, and we'll be looking also at the ways that European and migrant organizations are resisting those policies. So without due delay, we are moving now to our first speaker. Wendela, please, the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. Nice to see you here. I'm Wendela De Vries from Stop Wapenhandel, which is a grassroots campaign and research group on arms trade and the arms industry. And I first want to congratulate the campaigners with the success of ending the lease of Elbit drones by EMSA. And I already have some questions on that, on how the decision is taken, how it is communicated. Do they openly state that the Israeli company is the problem, or do they give a technological excuse? And also very important, what will these drones be replaced with? Because they will want to have something. Certainly we are not there yet. Major developments are taking place. It was already mentioned, border agency Frontex is now allowed to buy its own system, and this will speed up the border militarization process, and Frontex has granted contracts to Airbus Industries and IAI and Elbit for 50 million each at the expense of Italian Leonardo for surveillance flights in the Mediterranean, and Greece is leasing IAI Heron drones for border patrols. The more advanced types of these drones are armed, but these specific types are for target spotting, equipped with cameras and other receivers for moving targets in this case being migrants. The drones stations and the information analysis will be taken from Europe. I'm wondering where the pilot training will take place. That might well be Israel. Okay, I want to have a look at the arms industry as the main player here. Cooperation with Israel is of great economic importance for the European arms industry, which is facing strong competition from the US arms industry, which has the advantage of enormous internal markets and enormous Pentagon funds. European arms industries are much smaller, often national companies, and they are struggling to keep up the competition with the United States. And modern arms are very expensive to develop. The research and development costs are high, and they are difficult for the European firms who miss the US companies' advantage of scale. So to have only European armed forces as customers is too limited. So they have to earn back when they want to earn back on their research investments. And this is a driving force behind European arms export. an arms export that leads to more armed conflict and to more refugees. And it's also a driving force behind the product differentiation that brings arms industries to produce for the security market. Producing for security works both ways, because technology developed for military security can be used in civilian security and vice versa. So there's a lot of overlap in technology. So there's it's good to have both for the industries. The European Union is providing research funds for industry and institutional research. European military companies can get funding from Brussels for the private company research with public money. Until short, these funds were not accessible for military production. There was, however, a lot of semi-military production and dual-use research under the heading of security that could apply for this public money from the European Union. I'm not sure if I tell not something that everybody knows already, but I think I start with the basics so that we know where we stand. Under the EU Framework Programme 2007-2013, it was 2.8 billion euro available for military, enough for security research, and under the follow-up program Horizon 2020, that was already 3.8 billion euro for this kind of research. Israel is associated in this European Union research programs. And for the European industry, this is a huge interest in this cooperation. Because in many areas, including drones, Israeli companies and universities are technically ahead of European institutions. So the European arms industry is trying to catch up with joint production and joint development with companies like Elbit and IEI. Drones for border controls are very interesting for the arms industry, but the real profit lies in the further development of this market and the development of practical and juridical infrastructure for drones, because there is much at stake for the European arms industry. One military commander recently said that by 2030, 1/3 of the UK army will be consisting of drones. We might be exaggerating, but there is certainly a big future here. Europe is developing big male drones by French, German, Italian consortium, and there is also a very ambitious future combat air system program, which is developing fighter jet, but also swarm drones. Europe must catch up on this development. If they don't, they lose completely this market, and their arms industry actually will be finished. And this is not acceptable for the European armed forces. So it's very difficult to bring this into debate because the economic interests are so big. There's also the political and the ideological dimension to convince the European governments to fund and to buy these technologies. The arms industry has hired mass of lobbyists. They are lobbying in Brussels and in the European capitals to tell the politicians that military technology is a solution for European security. Not only the military products should help against military threats, but also to the major headache of European politicians, which is migration. And it's very, very attractive for politicians to have a quick fix for an extreme complex problem. So they turn a human tragedy into a security tragedy, into a security problem, into a threat. And you can also see that in the strategic concept of the European countries and also in the NATO strategic concept. Who should we fear? We should fear the Russians, we should fear the terrorists, and we should fear the migrants. So this is the way in which the arms industry is marketing its products. It is changing something in people's minds. This concept of unarmed civilians as an enemy is nearly unquestioned in military circles. And I think this is very worrying. The armies are just accepting that civilians are their enemy and they should be standing against them. Well, European Parliament still has to give consent for the new European budget for 2021-2027. Frontex is in the books for 5.1 billion, almost 3 times as much as the budget from the last budget period. Part of this budget, several billions, will be to buy equipment. This is very interesting, of course, for the arms industry. And member states are also supposed to buy equipment themselves to give in use to Frontex, with funding from the Integrated Border Management Fund, which has a 5.5 billion euro budget as well. Also, not all will be for equipment, but a vast amount, several billions, will be reserved for buying equipment from the arms industry. Also interesting for the arms industry is that over the last years, the European Union is very active in developing European military capabilities. Most European Union countries are NATO members, but the idea is not to replace NATO, but to build a European military structure on top of NATO to make independent European deployment possible. Brussels says it wants strategic autonomy. It's not exactly clear what that means. It means different things in different countries, depending on national preferences and national political constellations. It's also not exactly clear what this European military should do. There's not something like a real well-developed European common foreign policy, common security policy idea. There is some agreement that it should close off the borders. That's mostly the point on which politicians can agree very quickly in this area. And the taboo of not funding military production has disappeared overnight. In fact, there has been hardly any discussion, nor in the Parliament, nor in the Commission, nor in the member states, on starting to fund military production, and there has already been dedicated nearly 600 million euro for military research and development over the last years. And for the new European budget, there is a request for 8 billion euro for military research and development support in a European defense fund for the military industry. And several areas are identified as priority, including drone production. It's of course a question if third countries, so-called third countries such as Israel, could also be participating in this new source of money. It's some sources it is unlikely because it's so clearly European money from the European budget, so clearly designed for military production that it will be difficult. But there is already a precedent because there's also another development called PESCO that is to stimulate common military projects and common capability development between European countries, another part of this militarization of the European Union. And last week, it was decided that in PESCO, third country companies can participate. This is especially important for the UK, which is now leaving European Union. Yes, I'm nearly finished. And also for the United States, which has a lot of common production with European companies, of course, and Norway, who is always into the European armament thing without actually being part of it. And there is a very interesting exception, a very interesting clause that third countries can only join if no other country has an objection. This is clearly a gesture to Greece that can then exclude the Turkish defense industry. But I have heard nobody mention Israel yet, but it is not unlikely that Israel will be one of the countries that is interested in joining this project. And it is a campaign possibility here. When you can find one country that objects to Israel participating, you can stop Israel from doing this. Well, so far my contribution. I hope I was not too fast for the translators.
Thank you very much, Wendela.
Thank you very much.
Insightful presentation about the militarization of Europe. And now we will move to Brigitte, that will tell us a little bit about the European anti-migration and militarization policies as well. Brigitte, over to you.
Thank you very much. Yes, I will be talking about the immigration policies, anti-immigration policies, actually. So Europe, you know that, has been pursuing repressive and security policies against people on the move for 30 years now. And these policies have progressively restricted the field of regular immigration and have set as a priority the fight against irregular immigration. So to this end, well, the European Union and its member states have developed a lot of coercive legislative, administrative, and political measures. While the number of displaced persons in the world continues to increase, the UNHCR talks about 80 million forced displacements at the end of 2019. Well, and we know that they are mostly hosted by southern countries. Europe is increasing the inaccessibility of its territory to protect its border in disregard of its international obligations and in disregard of people's rights. So in the first instance, legal channels of entry into the EU have been drastically reduced through restrictive visa and asylum policies. And as a result, people in the move have been prevented from legally entering and residing in Europe. So we can talk about, I'm sorry, we can talk about a war on migrants, even more after the crisis of migration policies in 2015. From this date, we'll witness what the French researcher Louis Tassin calls a spectacularization of borders that we have seen in the medias. We saw the last years a normalization of the hostility and violence against those who are presented and sometimes perceived as a threat to European security and public order, thus legitimating the use of military-style defense devices against them. So states and supranational entities such as the EU face a problem of legitimacy, a loss of confidence. And in order to reaffirm the prerogatives and power of the states, it is necessary for them to be efficient in the management of a so-called crisis situation, reinforcing visible and tough repression, designating the undesirable ones and excluding them either from the territory or from the rule of law. And so it is necessary to discourage the candidates for immigration, attacking their rights, like in Greece, for example, and reassuring the general public by buying like a social peace, no? So in addition to an exercise of political communication, it is also the expression of a social control, a form of domination that owes much to the legacy of neocolonialism policies. So obstacles to the mobility have multiplied, including on other continents and in other sub-regional areas of free movement. And European control mechanisms that were supposedly adopted in response to an emergency situation in 2015 have been maintained beyond the so-called crisis, even though fewer and fewer people in the move managed to cross the EU borders. So EU leaders have continued to accumulate measures and action plans to stem migration. And the number of deaths in the Mediterranean, for example, is very high, since what is provided is not rescue at sea, but surveillance, as Wendela has told us. So the measures that have been taken since 2015 are in line with the orientations followed since the early beginning of this century. I mean, 2000s. So we can see the detention of non-nationals, enclosed center like detention centers or police stations, or in so-called open centers in Europe, like hotspots that were set up in southern Italy and the Greek islands. Just a word to say that no one can ignore that instead of reception centers, the hotspots are used as detention and sorting sites, and that are prejudicial to migrants' rights. And that was exactly the purpose at their creation. The violations of rights were perfectly predictable. And according to this logic, the hotspot approach is a real success. And the camps are meant to be institutionalized and copied both inside and outside Europe. We also have seen a development of a policy of externalizing anti-migration measures, which interest new actors, private actors like airlines, or state actors like third countries, and which take many forms. We can think about the informal agreement concluded by the EU with Turkey in March 2016. This had led to the development of soft law since then. We can think about the joint way forwards between EU and Afghanistan to be renegotiated in 2020, the Compact Migration in Africa, but also the European Pact on Asylum and Migration, which is a political declaration that will transform ideology and practices in law. We have seen the militarization of the sea in the name of the fight against smugglers. 2 military operations have been launched in the sea to fight against smugglers. The first is the naval operation EUNAVFOR Med, renamed Sophia, launched by the EU in the southern part of the central Mediterranean between Italy and Libya in 2015. And the second is the operation between EU and NATO in the name of the fight against human trafficking in the agency. We have to see that NATO's intervention in European territorial waters definitely integrates the issue of migration in the domain of defense and establishes it as a threat. So it is particularly representative of the war waged by Europe against civilians in migration in a militarized context. Actually, the member states are in reality fighting not against smugglers, but against people on the move in these kinds of operation, which are absolutely useless in view of the stated objective, and that put no end to the arrival of migrants who will be forced to use other dangerous routes. We have seen too the militarization of borders through the sophistication of surveillance equipment and the deployment since 2015 of the armed force of European countries to increase border security in order to prevent any land or sea entry. Of course, we think about the European agency Frontex that mobilized military means and technology to close the doors of the EU in this regard, not only of the people on the move's rights, but also of their lives. It has not been denied seats, as we see every day, the EU's renunciation in the Mediterranean Sea or the let them die strategy. The reinforcement of the means of Frontex we have seen in 2011, in 2016, in 2019, and just that we know, French President Macron indicated last week that Frontex should be strengthened and given more means, but what for, we don't really understand, since it is the European agency with the biggest budget in the European Union. It passes from 19 millions in 26 till 40-60 millions in 2020. So it's a huge increase. And however, we have seen for the past 10 years that Frontex has been strengthening without any independent control, without any effective mechanism to question its responsibility or to make it accountable in case of human rights violations. Actually, we have seen, according to investigation of several media, that Frontex is accused to be complicit in illegal pushbacks of migrants in the agency on the border between Turkey and Greece on at least 6 occasions. And actually the European Commission has requested an urgent extraordinary meeting of the Frontex Management Board today. So we can say that instead of providing sea rescue in the Mediterranean, the EU is expanding air surveillance. For example, EUNAVFOR Med has withdrawn its ship in March 2019 and has developed another operation to enforce the UN embargo on Libya, upon the weapons on Libya. We have seen also the militarization of immigration management in Europe and beyond, the militaristic transformation of the border police, the role of the armed force in border management in a lot of countries, like in the Balkans, but as well as the borders of Italy and Greece in the hotspots. We can also say that this militarization of immigration management also impacts third states. In the Sahel region, European military operations that were created to combat cross-border crime and terrorism are now seen as an additional means to cut off migration routes. We also see that these containments also extend to European internal borders, since a lot of border walls have been reestablished and erected in the majority of European countries. The use of violence against refugees and migrants is rising. Border police using dogs, tear gas, tasers against people trying to cross the borders, particularly in the Balkans. On the Greek-Turkish border and in the agency, violence is rising. We can see that firearms by Greek and European police forces to stop boats is a standard practice implemented. We have seen, of course, the collaboration with Libyan Coast Guards. And in March 2020, we have seen the culmination of a situation of no rights at the Greek-Turkish border, with the suspension of rescues at sea, interventions by the Greek army at the borders with the help of extreme right-wing militias, attacks on migrants at sea, sabotage, violent pushbacks, shooting on people, suspension of the right to asylum, racist attacks, violent arrests and beatings, etc., etc. So we can say that even though the number of migrants entering the EU is falling, public policies on immigration are increasingly strict, seeking at all costs to limit migration movements, regardless of the legal and humanitarian consequences. Of course, we see less arriving and more dying. Since the 90s, Europe's war against migrants has officially killed more than 50,000 people. Borders are extended beyond the physical boundaries with funding from northern countries to countries such as Libya, Niger, Tunisia, to turn these countries into border hotspots to prevent people on the move from leaving. This policy of containment has led to more violations of the rights of people on the move who are stuck in transit countries, where violence against people is notorious, but far from the European public eye. Just another example, France and Italy will deploy ships and planes to alert Tunisia on the departure of migrants. It was announced just after the last attacks in France, terrorist attacks on the 6th of November. I could add that the high technology is used, of course, for this militarization, biometrics, national and European databases, to mask maybe or disembody the tasks that are asked to the militaries, to the border police. But in contrast, there is an increasingly policed and framed and humanitarian language, which is a huge symbolic violence with the physical, of course, violence. I would end saying that, of course, European migration policies are not based on humanity, but on security. They are cyclical and repetitive. And one example is the United Kingdom. In 2003, Prime Minister Blair talked about outsourcing asylum to portals outside Europe. And in 2020, the UK was talking about imitating the Australian Pacific solution by relegating asylum seekers out of the European territory on remote islands. So in fact, most of the means released by the European Union with the consent of the European Parliament is intended to send back or to put aside people on the move. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Brigitte, for this very clear presentation of European anti-migration policy. We will now hear more from Amal about how, in fact, those militarization and anti-migration policies look on the ground. Amal, over to you.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for invitation and for organizing this important talk. I arrived to Lesbos 3 years ago, and I was one of thousands of people who was forced to stay in Moria refugee camp. When first time I saw Moria camp from outside, I thought it is a prison because it was surrounded by big walls, barbed wire, and police, and you can see police and army everywhere. Many people say also was saying the same. Moria camp is a prison, and Lesbos Island is a prison island. But when I lived inside Moria camp, I discovered no, it is not a prison. It is a hell. Because in the prisons all over the world, the prisoner have the right to have access to decent food, to medical care, or legal advice, or lawyer. And also they have the right to know why they are inside this prison and for how long they will stay and what crime they did to be in this prison. But we are treated as less than a human. I am Palestinian, but I have never been in Palestine. And I guess the Zionist prisons for Palestinians are not much different. The thing I remember when I arrived to Moria that the government told us we will stay in the camp like maximum 25 days. But what happened later, some people stay for 25 months. And they told us you will stay 25 days, then you will be moved to the mainland to continue your asylum procedure. But it was a lie. We don't know for what we are stuck in this hell, for what reason, for how long. And for sure, after staying for 3 months in this hell, you will have mental problems, you will have PTSD. Because all these people run away from war, from death, trying to find a peaceful place to live, trying to find better life. But they found themselves imprisoned in Moria camp. And they don't have anything to do during the day, and at night you can find in the camp all kinds of drugs and alcohol, and fight starting for sure, because people, they don't have anything to do, they don't have any way to escape from their situation. The only way to escape is to have some drugs and drink alcohol. I am not a psychologist, but when any person forced to live in this condition with no escape and nothing to do, and no information on what will happen to you later, it is not surprise that anger and tensions start to grow and people start fighting with each other. Even if you have a chance to leave the camp and go to the city, you will face discrimination everywhere in the city. And if you try also to find something to do with your time, not to lose your mind, to be like a volunteer in an organization, some organization treated you different than other organization. They, as a volunteer, they don't name you as a volunteer. They give you another name like community volunteers or refugee volunteers, different than other volunteers who come from other countries. They name them international volunteers. I don't know what this name comes from, but it is like, I feel like we are from different planet. They are international, we are community volunteers. And other organizations want to convert you to Christianity and save your life, as if you don't know anything about survival. And also there is organization which is supported by the Zionist Israeli government. It is called Israel, pretend to support refugees by doing humanitarian work in Greece. But it is part of their plan of whitewash Israeli crimes against Palestinians and would never accept our rights to return back to our country, to Palestine, and stay there. And year after year, the situation in Moria camp became worse and worse, and with the support of many NGO who thinks they will make our life and the situation better, but how you can make the hell better? If something is good, you can make it better, but if something is a hell, it is impossible to be better. There is no way. No one can live in this hell. It was for sure the decision of the government to make the situation of Moria camp and all camps in Greece like this, so no one will think to come to Greece. And there is nothing called refugee crisis or humanitarian crisis, because it is the government who decided to make the camps like they are now. And some humanitarian actors working inside the camp try to help us, but in reality, they are helping the government to keep people imprisoned in this hell and keep people from resisting and protesting this hell. All of this situation of the Moria camp led to Moria to be burned down in September. And unfortunately, a new camp was built with the help of many organizations, which the new camp is worse than Moria camp, with the help of many organizations and with the help of UNHCR and UNICEF and many NGOs and organizations. This is the same, I think this is the same like in Palestine, where for many years, especially since Oslo, humanitarian actors operate with the full support of the Israeli occupation. At the same time in Greece, like in Palestine, the government is trying to close or stop the work of solidarity organization who refused to support the government or who don't accept what the government is doing. For example, there was a refugee camp in Lesbos called Pikpa camp, which where the most vulnerable refugees lived. The camp was run by a solidarity organization that didn't support the government. And when Pikpa was forced to close just 10 days ago, vulnerable families, many children and sick people were surrounded by many police and evicted with force and violence. It showed that the government will try to stop anyone who is providing real support to refugees. You can only act if you are somehow supporting the government policies only. But there are some people who are still trying to work against these policies, like in Bikba. And for example, there are some organizations who have refused to work inside the new camp because they don't agree or don't support the government making a new concentration camp. And for weeks, people refused to move to the new camps, even though they were living in the street with no support behind the police checkpoints. They only moved to the new camp after being forced there by police, because people will never accept to be put in prison for no reason. And no matter what government does, people will find different ways to resist this. And another example, what is going on the sea, the Greek Coast Guard is stopping refugees from arriving after stealing their money, passport, belongings, and leaving them in the middle of the sea in boats with no motors, where they are then taken back to Turkey without any support, without any protection. But people are still arriving to Greece, no matter how many times they are pushed back to Turkey, because it is impossible to live in Turkey. And people will find ways to survive no matter what Europe tries to do to us. And us not to forget that we are here because what Europe is, because Europe is destroying our countries. That's why we are here. It wasn't our choice to be here. Thank you, Europe.
Thank you, Amal, for this very moving testimony and presentation. Thank you so much. We will move on to Flo from Sea-Watch, who will be also explaining how does the European militarization and anti-immigration policies work on the ground from the perspective of the Sea-Watch. Claude, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you well, yeah.
So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me on this amazing panel, and thank you to the organizers for putting it together. It's especially an honor to follow Amal, who is amazing. So my name is Chloe. I'm an activist with the civil rescue organization Sea-Watch, although I'm also from Lesbos. I think that some of you might know us from our ships. They're sort of symbols now, but I'm going to talk to you about search and rescue from the perspective of our reconnaissance aircraft, Moonbird. So this is partly because, as I'll explain, I think other people have started explaining, the border regime has undergone a general reorientation in the Mediterranean from the sea to the sky. And because in many ways, the sky is kind of a more useful vantage from which to understand the border as a political force field. From the air, you learn how to make out shipping corridors, oil platforms, fishing clusters, state assets, so the Coast Guard, NATO, Frontex, the outlines of different migrant boats, wooden, rubber, adrift, underway, shipwrecked. And most importantly, you begin to make sense of how these different actors are actually engaging each other, how policy hits the ground, who is seeing whom, who is asking for help, who is responding or ignoring them, who is resisting, and who is left to die. So over the past couple of years, we've witnessed a really rapid escalation of practices of deterrence and killing by the EU border regime. In order to skirt their obligation to render assistance to migrants in distress and to bring them to a place of safety, EU member states have come increasingly to rely on border externalization agreements, bankrolling neighboring states to conduct the dirty work of border defense for them. So setting up a system of what we call pushbacks by proxy. In 2017, Italy invented a Libyan Coast Guard by training and equipping former militias to intercept and return migrant boats as far north as 25 miles offshore Lampedusa, so well outside their area of competence, almost in Italian territorial waters, contiguous waters. Once intercepted, migrants are brought to detention centers in Libya, where they face torture, extortion, and death by the same militias. So the thinking behind this arrangement is that migrants at sea are either intercepted by the Libyan Coast Guard or they die. Either way, they don't really become Europe's problem. So in the meantime, while European assets, the Coast Guard, Frontex, that formerly patrolled the search and rescue zone have purposefully abandoned the area, European authorities have set out to punish the only ships remaining that both actively seek out migrants in distress, offering them a pathway to Europe, and are the only real witnesses to the violence, humiliation, and neglect that sustain the EU border regime. And so it's us, the NGOs. So since 2017, the criminalization of solidarity has involved the confiscation of our ships, allegations of collusion between NGOs and traffickers, and massive criminal proceedings based in anti-mafia and anti-terror law. So more recently, port authorities have used absurd administrative procedures to keep us from operating. So Sea-Watch 4, which is now being kept in port here in Palermo, is basically being kept in port because we had too many life jackets on board, and this is a safety hazard. So I don't know, just let that sink in. Like whoever comes up with this stuff has a real sense of humor. But while the central Mediterranean Sea has been depopulated of state assets and NGO ships, it's not that those people have gone, obviously, as we've been listening to a lot. The EU border has just shifted the ground of engagement elsewhere. So mostly by massively investing in aerial surveillance through aircraft such as Maltese and Italian Air Force assets or Uniform Med fleets, or more recently, as we've heard, drone operations designed by a joint venture of Airbus, Israel Aerospace Industries, and Elbit Systems, which, as you know, is a private Israeli weapons manufacturer, which has long been a resource for EU surveillance tactics. So basically what happens is that shifting assets to the air allows European authorities to gain knowledge of the presence of boats in distress and their position without having to actually engage in rescue activities. Instead, in a form of remote control, they pass that intelligence on to the Libyan Coast Guard and provide them with support from the sky so that the people can be intercepted and returned to Libya. Again, pushbacks by proxy. So what do we do about it? Well, first of all, as the border moves, we move with it. It's kind of a biting piece of irony that Sea-Watch's aircraft takes off from the same airport as Frontex and Uniform Med in Lampedusa. So we literally take our coffee elbow to elbow. I mean, we obviously don't speak, but then we walk over to the same part of the apron and we take off in the same direction. And one aircraft is there to enforce the border regime and the other one is there to fight it. And because the authorities keep us in the dark about open cases, we sometimes follow them or try to trace their flight patterns in order to figure out where they've been circling a distress case. We eavesdrop on their marine distress channels and aviation VHF for the coordinates of a boat that someone has sighted. We patrol the shoreline looking for boats with our naked eye or try to follow up on cases communicated to alarm phone. So one of the blessings of being on board a search and rescue ship is that you can intervene directly in a distress case. You can rescue the people. You meet them in a moment in which they've won the fight. They're going to make it to Europe. But in the aircraft, you're witnessing the situation unfold in real time, and there is nothing that you personally can really do directly about it. The Maltese Rescue Coordination Center will routinely not respond to distress calls. So all you can do is to try to demand, intimidate, and sometimes beg the nearest vessel to assist. In the absence of EU state assets, the only vessels around are commercial ships, which not only have no rescue capacity, but are under immense pressure not to render assistance to migrant boats. Rescuing them means losing time, which means being late for their next port of call, which means that their company might incur substantial financial losses. And to be clear, if there were a yacht or a boat of white people in distress in the area, they would absolutely rescue them. But at this point, refugees in distress have become part of the background noise of the Mediterranean. It's best to pretend that they don't exist, basically. So for instance, yesterday I was trying to think of examples and I remembered that in July we found a boat of 17 people. The people's relatives had called alarm phone to say that they had been adrift for 4 days without food and water. I spoke to the captain of Vasilevousa, a Greek tanker 2 miles away, who refused to rescue but reassured me that he would stay on scene until a rescue asset arrived. The next morning we flew back there and the migrants were still there, but the tanker had left. So they had just abandoned the people. When they saw us, the people jumped overboard and held onto empty fuel canisters and tried to swim to a ship on the horizon. We contacted another ship in the area, the BW Thames, to tell them that there were people in the water, and the captain basically told us to fuck off. And finally, the Asso 29, a supply vessel for a nearby oil rig, agreed to pick them up. The boat had left Zuara with 17 people, and only 11 were rescued. So people who are in the search and rescue zone remember the names of every single one of the ships that refused to engage and of the few that did. The Muscatien, for instance, whose captain changed course immediately when we notified him the wooden boat of 27 people was adrift in bad weather, 11 miles from his position. The captain rescued them, and he was punished for this basic act of decency. For 35 days, the Maltese authorities refused to let them into port, leaving the crew and the migrants drifting just outside territorial waters. And it was meant to serve as a cautionary tale for other commercial captains. And finally, there are cases in which the boat is in distress, adrift, or taken in water, and no one is responding, and the only ship nearby is the Libyan Coast Guard. So when I was working on our rescue ship, Sea-Watch 3, the people we rescued, when they were on board, we would have the time to talk, and they would say that they would rather die at sea than be returned to Libya. And in fact, when migrants see the Libyan Coast Guard approaching, they often jump overboard. But being on the plane means that you can't talk to the people. You don't know what they want. But you imagine that in the end, everybody wants to live. So you inform the Libyan Coast Guard and you end up participating in a pushback. You who are supposed to be the solidarity activist and part of this 21st century underground railroad. And this is the stuff that drives you a little bit insane, that even though you're up against this huge billion-dollar industry where all the odds are stacked against people on the move, you still think that maybe if you had done something differently, the outcome might have been different. So in this context of incredibly unequal struggle, it's easy to feel totally helpless. For NGOs, like, I'm not gonna lie about it, this is a moment of defeat. Since Moonbird began documenting and publishing evidence of non-assistance and pushbacks by European authorities, we have been chased out of everywhere: Tunisia, Malta, Italy. But paradoxically, one thing that people who actually operate in the central Mediterranean realize sooner than others is that even though the border regime presents as this highly efficient, intelligent system, this impregnable fortress, it's actually full of holes. Surveillance systems are constantly breaking down or missing things. They're not as intelligent as we think. Often our intel is better than theirs and they try to follow us. Our tiny little aircraft has more endurance over the water than Frontex's, which keeps having engine trouble. So my point is that the EU border is evil, but it's nowhere near as invincible as it wants you to think. It gets broken all the time, and usually it gets broken by migrants themselves. Every time they win and make it across the sea, sometimes with our help, but often without it. And it's no coincidence that, at least among Tunisians, the expression for migrating is to burn the border. And I guess that I just want to end by thinking about what it means for us to want to burn the border together. What is the content of that struggle? So Sea-Watch likes to distinguish itself from humanitarian organizations because we are expressly political. And it's true that we are all radical leftists and we're at the heart of a really vast organizing network. But by and large, especially when we're unable to sail to the rescue zone, our organizing relies on a logic of witnessing and denunciation, a defensive legal strategy based in human rights litigation. We document instances of non-insistence of pushbacks, we bring them to the European Court of Human Rights, and we hope that it might make a difference, which realistically it doesn't. So a lot of us are now really tired of denouncing and condemning and expressing bewilderment because actually no one is really surprised anymore. And I think it's common knowledge among activists that human rights are sometimes less a tool of radical action than something you fall back on because your capacity to imagine something different is depleted. What makes human rights radical is the movement that demands them. And I think that that's something that deserves more reflection, especially in my own organization. After 2015, huge numbers among the European left really became invested in border struggles, but often campaigning around refugee rights in the Mediterranean does not really account for itself or what the movement really is, partly because it rarely engages people on the other side in a truly internationalist politics, whether that be anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist. More recent abolitionist calls to defund the border, which echo Black Lives Matter movements to defund the police in the US, might become a really significant instance of that. And I guess that's why events such as these are so important, not only because it helps us define our common enemy, like Elbit systems or Israeli intelligence, because identifying the enemy is easy. Rather, they're useful because they help to identify who we are. After all, one reason that internationalist solidarity with Palestinians has historically been so powerful is because a certain tradition of anti-colonial struggle saw the liberation of Palestine as expressing universalist ambitions for a kind of collective emancipation for oppression by empire, capital, race. And perhaps it sounds naive to raise it now, but I think that it's worth thinking about when we think about defining the political content of border struggles, how they relate to exploitation by race and capital on either side of the Mediterranean, and basically, what do we want to burn when we burn the border? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chloe, for this excellent presentation. We will be moving now to Raya. The title of our webinar is the EU-Israel Nexus, Militarization, Migration, and Apartheid. So we move to Raya from Who Profits, who will explain us exactly what, how does this nexus works exactly between the European Union and Israel in terms of military connections. Raya, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for organizing this. Thank you for including me in this conversation and Who Profits. And I guess I just wanted to, first of all, extend solidarity to everybody that finds themselves on the move for whatever given reason, and to everybody at the moment around the globe kind of resisting and struggling against racist, imperialist, and capitalist policies kind of aligning together at the same time. So I kind of just wanted to start with that. And I guess I was asked a little bit to talk more specifically about Israel and the EU, but I kind of want to zoom a little bit out of that. And I think the presentations before kind of really set the ground really nicely for us to be able to think about the intersection of capital, private companies, colonial histories, imperialism, and how they kind of all of these interwork together in shaping the world that we live in today, the oppression that we face on a myriad of levels, but also how they can be understanding how these things, how these elements intersect with each other and how they work together can also help us in kind of thinking together, as Chloe was saying, about what brings us together and what formation does our resistance take, and how is it shaped. And I think this is kind of a wonderful conversation and an important opportunity to kind of have this conversation. So I guess I kind of wanted to talk about the role of Israel more generally in global arms trade. Why has that become the case, and what does that actually mean about the nature of this settler colonial project? In the strive of kind of untangling some things and thinking together about how we can formulate better forms of resistance that kind of encompass all of these elements together. And so I guess it's not necessarily novel to think, the idea that Israel is a global and a major player in the global arms trade is not a novel one, but I guess I'll just put some numbers. I'll put some numbers on it. So Israel is the 8th largest military exporter in the world. Between 2015 and 2019, Israeli military and technology of surveillance and homeland security technologies by Israeli governmental companies, but also by private companies, amounted to up to 3% of the global arms export on a global scale. So a huge and a major, definitely not a sideline player in this whole kind of element. In addition to exporting hard arms, Israel is very much has a high-tech oriented export industry as well. On an annual basis, Israeli cybersecurity companies export products and services that amount to some $6.5 billion US. some of these products, as we know, land and, you know, anybody that is willing to buy can get access to these products. So it kind of can go from regime of Bahrain to Modi fascist regime in India, and virtually all European countries. And I guess Israel is always, well, not always, but after a certain particular historical moment, have tried to play this role, where it has developed itself as a structure that develops mechanisms of control and technologies from hardware to software, and exports them internationally. And it has really historically aligned itself with various formations and different regimes that are repressive, right? But it also exploits particular moments, particular historical junctures as marketing opportunities. So this is very obvious in the case of the kind of, at the moment that Europeans started freaking out by the fact that people were on the move, looking and searching for security and to find life and so on, completely neglecting European historical role, Europe's historic and current role in the fact that people find themselves in these positions, and Israeli companies evidently found kind of in that an opportunity. At the moment, we are currently in the midst of this global pandemic, the coronavirus, and Israeli military companies are also trying to seize that as an opportunity, not only in the kind of the medical field, but also very clearly saying that this moment in history, there will be ruptures, there will be political and economic ruptures on a global scale, and states will need to find a way to control and repress populations. So what the Israeli Ministry of Defense is doing at the moment is that it's creating portfolios for country, virtually almost all countries around the globe, except the ones that Israel doesn't trade with, Iran, Syria, and Lebanon, creating portfolios outlining these countries' homeland security needs, whereby Israeli companies obviously are looking and eyeing to kind of fulfill those needs. And this is kind of important because for the Israeli military homeland security surveillance industry, the mass majority of its revenue is not generated on the local market, because the local market is relatively small. So if you think about companies like Elbit, I mean, it's been mentioned quite a lot. In 2019, Elbit's revenues were around $4.5 million US. Only around $1 million US of those were generated on the local market. So through the Israeli military, of course, and military apparatus locally, but the mass majority was exported and generated globally. And I guess, I think there's kind of, it's interesting to think about the role of Israel on a global scale, because there's also a tendency to think that institutions such as the police or the state or the border police or whatever they are, they become kind of problematic, racist, repressive structures at the moment of interaction with problematic, kind of either with Israeli technology or with other formations of technology. But actually, I think it's much more like that was outlined here, is that those institutions are inherently racist. They are inherently part of oppressive structures that work in a much bigger dynamics, and then these technologies find home in them, right? So there's an alliance that becomes there. But with that in mind, it is also a fact that Israel has made itself central in the international arms and so-called homeland security industry. To deny this in a way would be to exceptionalize Israel, because this is essentially the role that it does play on a global on a global scale. It has exported its military, its doctrines, its tactics to regimes all over the world, but it has also taken from regimes. So that is the very nature of kind of the arms and surveillance industry. It is international in scale, and I guess this panel shows us how international in scale it is. So Israel's kind of exporting its technologies of border control, but not only. I mean, it's also exporting its technologies that are supposedly to deal with refugees and kind of homegrown terror once they kind of reach to Europe. So it's not just a question of reaching, but it's also when you're there, that's also a space that Israeli technology is integrating itself in and using very kind of racist terminology to describe their technology. So you have surveillance companies involved in mass surveillance in East Jerusalem, so surveying Palestinian bodies and so on. And the way that they describe themselves and market their technology is ability to kind of detect the wolf in the sheep's clothing and so on. And so we see, for example, in Jerusalem becoming really a showroom for urban surveillance technology. And it's really been used as a way, you have European police agencies and Homeland Security agencies coming to have a look at what's happening in Jerusalem as a model, as a living model, right? Like not just something that is articulated in kind of presentations or whatever, but you can actually see it in real life. And in a sense, this is part of how Israel has managed to develop into this, to play this role on the global market, is because its ability to kind of position itself as able to have kind of a live showroom for any form of weapons that you want. So, we besieged 2 million people in Gaza, and we have the ability to not let anybody be able to leave. And so we can show you how to manage your borders. We kind of control urban spaces in Jerusalem and Palestine 48. So we can show you how this is done in real life. And there's kind of no limitations to the various forms of technologies that can be implemented in this kind of human showroom. And so essentially, Israel's ability to play this role and its ability to develop these technologies is based on the fact that it's a settler colonial state that is involved in an ongoing colonial process, right, of control, elimination, and subjugation of the Palestinian people. So what Israel is able to sell to the world or to market to the world is kind of battle-proven technology, field-tested technology that is tested in real life on human bodies, and this essentially makes it superior technology. But it's not just that, because Israel is not just selling products, it's selling, to borrow kind of from Neve Gordon, Israel is selling an experience. It's kind of the ability to, so it's kind of the experience and the expertise and the self-conception rooted in its colonial project. So what is sold is essentially Israel's decades-long experience of repression of the Palestinian people in real life. And fundamentally, I guess, and that's important, funny, like when Chloe was talking about kind of the holes, how there's always a hole that people are able to find, and that there's a kind of a sense of always of I mean, certainly for Israel always tries to kind of position itself and market itself as this kind of all-encompassing, very powerful, non-penetratable kind of structure, and therefore our technology is so amazing and so fantastic and so on. But actually, the reason why Israel is constantly involved in this process of development and new technologies and this and that and this is because Palestinians are not passive subjects. They are, we're living organs, and people always try to find ways to resist. People always try to find holes in the system. And I think this is important. It's important for us to remember that, the necessity to develop all the time is born out of the very reality of resistance by real people on the ground. And so this tension is real. And I think we can acknowledge that in a way that doesn't move us away from knowing and also acknowledging the disparities of power between the colonial subjects and the colonial on the colonial state, but also at the same time give ourselves and give people agency in the ability to resist those technologies as we, you know, as living organs. And I think, but there's another kind of side of the story of why Israel plays the role that it does today, and I think that also links with the kind of looking at what's happening today, not as just actions kind of separated from each other, but as much part of a much kind of global economic and political, as an economic and political system. And I think it's important for us to remember and to kind of keep emphasizing that Israel is Israel of today, and it is where it is today, and it plays the role that it plays today is also because of its role in the region, but also in its relationship to imperialism, current and historic. And certainly Israel is not a fully sustaining military power. It exports huge amounts of military and technology, but also receives a lot of them. So it receives German manufactured Marines, it received German manufactured missile ships, it received in 2018 alone, it received UK manufactured weapons worth 17.8 million US dollars. It is the French state that actually aided the Israeli state to develop as a nuclear power after the 1956 Suez war, where Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. US military support to Israel was enhanced after the 1967 war, and kind of a reconfiguration and re-emphasis of the role that Israel can play in the region in the defeat of Arab nationalist movement at the time. But also, I think if we can think in the same vein about the kind of tide of normalization that is taking place at the moment in the region, and how that actually fits within a broader process of counter-revolutionary processes that have been happening in the region in a much more intense way since 2010. Israel's technology industry that is kind of that is growing and kind of massive, it's not self-sustainable. It relies heavily on venture capitalist investment. In 2019 alone, it had 8.3 billion US dollars of investment from venture capitalists in North America, but also massive European venture capitalist investment in Israeli high-tech industry, particularly in the cybersecurity industry and in artificial intelligence. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is that there's often a tendency to think of Israel exporting to the world, or Israel vis-a-vis the world, and certain sections of the world become more repressive or more racist because of this relationship with Israel, and solely because of that. And I think that's a mistake, but it's also a mistake to think about circulation of technology as kind of technology is moving in one way, or repressive technology and military technology is moving in one way. It's a much more circular relationships where technologies of repression move around different states for different interests, right? And certainly for Israel, it works in Israel's interest and political interest for these technologies to be integrated in kind of local governance. It benefits from this also financially, but it's also in the interest of kind of imperial powers, and European powers are definitely part of that, in bolstering Israel militarily, because of its specific role in the region and because of its specific positionality in global capitalism as well. So I guess it's not just about financial gains for private companies. Elbit is not just there for financial gains, but it's also shaping political realities regionally and on a global scale. So with that in mind, let's look a little bit at what kind of specifically the European Union's relationship with Israel. And the EU is one of Israel's biggest trading partners on kind of all levels. It is a centralized vessel through which Israeli companies, again, private and public, and also state institutions get access to European local markets. So in 2019, the European Union imported 12 million euros worth of Israeli goods. According to the European Commission, 3.9% of that 12 million were specifically of scientific technologies and control instruments. So this is in addition to kind of the drone that they buy or the kind of electrical and non-electrical machinery and communication software and kind of all of that stuff. But also, interestingly, in 2019, the European Union also exported 20 million euros worth of goods to Israel. 3.5% of those were also scientific and controlling instruments. So it's kind of a two-way relationship, right? Although the scale is kind of tilted towards Israel in a much more significant way. But I also think there's a kind of another way in which the EU, a role that there's another role that the EU plays, which we have to be attentive to. So on the one hand, it opens the market, it brings in Israeli technology and surveillance technology and hardware, military hardware, and so on to the European market. So states and the EU itself buys these, as was outlined by the previous speakers very well. But there's also different frameworks in which the EU pumps money directly into Israeli military companies and state structures more broadly that are invested in the repression of the Palestinian people on a daily basis, like the Israeli police, for example. But I think bringing Israeli companies, institutions, and so on under the framing of research and science, and we're doing great things for humanity and developing and so on. Yes, some of it is military and security in focus, but some of it is just, it's about water irrigation, and it's about, I don't know, like all sorts of kind of civil technologies that are supposed to be for the benefit of everyone at the same time, right? And this kind of sense of integration is, I think we have to kind of think about that in a much more serious way, because it's not just a question of kind of pumping money into private companies and private capital. What does this process of normalizing cooperation and the existence of such structures and such institutions that are actively involved in a process of ethnic cleansing of a people, right? Like, this is not just abstract companies in the same way that what Elbit is doing or any other company is doing in the Mediterranean, in the water, is not just an abstract thing. It has to really deals and relates to people's daily lives and people's lives and lived realities. And so the EU, by providing this umbrella of cooperation, is really normalizing the actual activity of these companies and these structures and institutions on kind of the basic level. So what are they doing? What are they doing here? And I think it's that. Yeah, I mean, I think we have to really be thinking about what do we do about that? How can we engage on that level? Because that's a much more subvert way of kind of bringing those mechanisms of oppression and repression into kind of the orbit of the realm of civil society, right? So when the Hebrew University does a project with a university in Belgium or whatever, with no conceptualization of the role of that institution outside of the specific structural cooperation, that is just a complete erasure of the Palestinian experience, a complete erasure of Palestinians' lived reality, and a complete erasure of the role that these institutions play beyond and outside of that specific framework. So I think those are kind of, they might seem not directly involved in kind of the policies that we want to fight against, but I think it's a form of soft power that is developing that helps to build this framework of kind of how racist institutions bond together, of how oppression on a global scale bonds together in a way that works for their interests. And I guess we have to think a little bit intently about what that means for us, and how do we bond together in ways that resist that, both for kind of the specific, but also how the specific relates to a global question at the same time.
Great, thank you so much, Raya, for this insightful presentation. So till now, we have heard from our speakers about the EU militarization, anti-migration policies, but also about some ways of the resistance from the legal center in Lesbos and from the perspective in Sea-Watch. We can mention very briefly some other examples of, let's say, successful struggles, but we have to keep in mind that it's a long-term struggle. However, when we come together, we can make a change and have an impact. So the first example is an example about the Law Train project. The project was funded by the European Research Program, and it was the project that aimed at exchanging methods of interrogation between the Israeli police and the European countries. And because, of course, of the problematic nature of the project and the involvement of Israeli police in the tortures, a wide European campaign was organized, which ended up in Portugal withdrawing from the project, and also in Catholic University from Belgium, KU Leuven, also didn't enter the second phase of the project. So that was what happened a couple of years ago. Another recent example is the fact that during the campaign organized by World Without Walls Europe, we managed to collect 10,000 signatures under the petition to the European institutions to end contracts with the Israeli drones. So of course we have now SEA, Portuguese company that didn't prolong contract with Elbit Systems. On the other hand, we of course have Frontex, but however, it shows that we can have an impact when we mobilize, but the struggle continues. The other example is the recent statement from the People's Tribunal on Migration that had a conference in October in Berlin, when they said that the asylum policies of German government and the European countries in general and the EU are violating human rights, and in particular the right to health. We will have now, just for 2 minutes, very briefly, Rafael from BDS Italy, who will speak about their research showing the connections between the Italian government and Israel. And afterwards we go very quickly also to the questions and answers part. So please stay with us a bit longer. Rafael, over to you.
Okay. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah.
You don't see me, but it's good for you. Okay.
We don't see you, unfortunately.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. Okay. Hi, everybody. Just 2 minutes, because yes, after Raya's speech, I think my short contribution is what we have done in the last year in Italy. BDS is a research on the complicity between Italy, especially, and Europe, with Israel in the only of the borders, but in the arms trade and in the cooperation in the securitization. And the more we study, the more we research, the more we found. It's incredible, the amounts and the numbers of cooperation between Italian arms system and also the academic system and the Israeli counterparts. It's really a shame, but we are the 4th country trading in this field with Israel in the European Union. And this, just to say one number, from 1990 to last year, 2019, the amount of money, of arms exported to Israel from Italy amounted to 78 million euros, which is incredibly big amount. And we have a special, Italy has a special relation with Israel. It signed in 2005 a memorandum of understanding, and which is almost secret because only little part of it is open, in which, and this memorandum is renewed, this agreement is renewed every year tacitly, and under which all kind of cooperation is carried on. And lately we found out that Italy is selling new, so very highly sophisticated helicopters to Israel. And of course, Israel doesn't pay, but it pays back with more technology, war technologies. So both Italian and Israeli taxpayers pay for these exchanges. And this is the rule. And another part of this research, which started as a pamphlet, we thought it could be just a few pages, and it turned out that we printed more than 245 pages with a lot of data, and we found out a big amount of relationship between academic and research centers in Italy and Israeli ones. Almost every university in Italy has exchanges in this field with Israeli counterparts. Sorry, and nobody knows about it. Only very few people know. And I think this is a basis. This pamphlet, this book is a basis for all the no war movement in Italy. And of course, it's in Italian, but if you are interested in exchanging data and information, we have already a very good group of researchers and some of the most prepared in Italy in almost every field. And we are eager to have exchange with other, not only BDS, but other groups around Europe and the world about this, because people don't know. People should be aware of what our governments are doing and what they're doing mostly in secret rooms. I think this is enough, but just to say the last thing, as you all know, Jeff Halper, he will say, this is a war against the people. This is a war that governments fight to control us, to control movement, to avoid people movement. And the fact that Israel is not, say, accused by the rest of the world is because it has close relations in this field, weapons and control, with more than 130 countries out of the 182, I think, of the UN. And they have good relations with most of these countries. And this is why they're not kept in jail. That's it.
Thank you very much, Rafael, for the presentation. We arrived to the part of questions and answers, but we are also a bit long with the time, or short on time. There was one question about the reading list. Yes, we are going to share the reading list with the articles on the Facebook pages of Stop the Wall and ECCP, so please do follow, and in the event as well. And now the question to all the panelists. So if you can answer, the question is, with all the current developments that were mentioned during the talk, what do the speakers think are the most important things we as campaigners and activists should focus on in the near future, and where we can cooperate as migration, anti-militarization, and Palestine solidarity activists? So this is the question to all the speakers. Let's start, as at the beginning, with Vendela, very briefly. Thank you.
That's a difficult question to start with. I hoped you would ask somebody else first to give me some time to think.
We don't see you. Can you put your camera on, please? Or
my camera is on.
Oh, okay.
But doesn't work.
Okay.
I don't know what's wrong here. This now I move. Okay. Yeah. Phew, this is really difficult. Well, Well, I think what we start with today is exchanging the knowledge and the visions but I think in the end it starts with making clear that people are not something that you can fight with weapons or migration cannot be stopped with borders or with walls, because you're talking about people. I mean, the mindset, the idea that people are migrants are the enemy is, in my opinion, the biggest problem. But it's very difficult to change that. But I think I find it shocking that you find civilians as enemies back in military strategies, and I think people are not aware of how far this is going and how much dehumanization is taking place. So I think this is the core of the problem we're facing.
Great, thank you, Wendela. Brigitte, the same question to you.
I'm not sure I understood the question. I'm sorry.
The question is, like, in the context of what was said today during the talks, what do you think are the most important things for us as the campaigners and activists to focus on in the near future in terms of how we can cooperate on which levels, on the levels like in the to counter this anti-migration and militarization policies, also as Palestine solidarity activists?
Okay, well, actually, we have to understand everything, because I think there are a lot of things that are being said or that are being decided, and we have to decode everything. So the first thing I think is better understand what is happening, what are these policies, and what is the impact of these policies. And then, well, I think that we should focus, and we are focusing on these, I don't know how to say that in English, but on these figures of the militarization, which is Frontex. We have to be able to not to control, but to understand and to maybe make a real plan to abolish Frontex. And the issue of criminalizing migrants and their supports is very, very worrying, and we should really work on this. So I thought it was really interesting, the presentation of Chloe in Sea-Watch, and of course in Moria. So I think we should really gather to have like maybe a campaign against this criminalization of solidarity.
Thanks so much, Brigitte. Gloria, Amal, would you like to go? I don't want to point at you, but maybe who feels to go first? Please, let's go.
I don't know, like, if I can answer this kind of a question. It is like, I am not activist or journalist. I am a simple person. But I think that the person asks you what you have to do, I think also he can answer this question, or I can ask him this question to the person who asked, like, what also, we not only want from you what, not we are waiting from you what you should do. All the people should be part of this, not only you. For me, it's like focusing on all the Israel deals with all Europe. We should work in it. We should work in killing people in the sea. It is what is going in the sea or in the borders. It is killing, not like people drown or what happened. Like, no, we are killing the people in the sea. This is what we need to focus in, and all the people in all countries should work with us, not only some campaigns, some activists.
Thank you so much, Amal. Raya, please share with us your thoughts. We will have to close in 3 minutes because the translators have to go. So I'm very sorry of pushing and on time, but we would love to hear your thoughts on the question.
Okay. I guess like one thing off the top of my head is something that I already mentioned, which is that we tend to organize against the border within Europe and not so much organizing with activists on the other side of the Mediterranean. So a little bit like we have contacts in Tunisia, but there isn't that much kind of internationalist organizing across. And ideally, I think that the agenda should be set by people on either side of the border and not just us. So I think that that's one thing. And then the second thing is to give away my kind of political origins, like is to kind of de-exceptionalize refugees and migration by basically kind of contextualizing it in other struggles, not other struggles, but related struggles, like to understand that migration and refugeehood is not something that exists kind of suspended from processes of state and capital accumulation and exploitation, and that those processes far exceed kind of the space of the border and kind of permeate. And so I think that a lot of the left kind of focuses on the kind of border as this like place of like contention that then kind of detracts from the fact that like actually this is happening within a much broader framework of exploitation. And that framework of exploitation is basically our kind of field of mobilization. So I think that one of the things is to not assume that somehow migration exists in a vacuum, but rather to kind of embed it as much as possible in these kind of more internationalist, more expressly anti-capitalist ambitions. I mean, if that's your thing.
Great, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts. Raya, a final word. We don't hear you, you have to
Yes. I think, first of all, I hope that anti-capitalist politics is everybody's thing on this call. And if it's not, then, it should be. Because I'm really lucky to be kind of constantly coming after Chloe, because I feel like we kind of bounce off each other in that way. But I certainly agree. I mean, I think a poverty of politics and a poverty of campaigning is sectional campaigning, and it's kind of this way of looking at issues as singular issues in their own thing. And I think, and that is in a way what we're always pushed to do, right? In this world of campaigns, like focus on one thing, deliverable, but actually the problems that we are faced with at the moment and the issues that we are faced with at the moment, and certainly the question of migration, it is not one that can be seen and related to in isolation. So here we bring in kind of the question of Israel, but Palestinians are also a migrant community, right? Like there's many Palestinian refugees around the world. We have to be able to kind of think about the unity between these different questions and I guess it's not more about more campaigns, but it's more about how do we articulate those? Like what is the political foundation of the activity that we do, and how does all of the formations of the various and different activity fits together, and how does it connect together? Because I think people are involved in wonderful work. I think people are putting a lot of energies in many different directions and in many different pockets, right? But I think a part of how these kind of campaigns end up just doing their own thing is our inability to kind of develop a joint frameworks upon which all of them sit together. And I think if there is anything for us to be doing, and if this current moment in time is really pushing us towards that direction, right? Because things are, whether we like it or not, it's not just a question of policy. It's not just a question of kind of this country versus that country. It's a question of kind of global politics and much more rooted structures of oppression that we have to be thinking about how do we bring those to the fore when we are campaigning, kind of also in our discourse, in our consciousness, and of how we connect to each other when we are active, whatever level and whatever campaign that we're active on. And so in that sense, I saw people asking about what you can do for Palestine or whatever. And I think, I think we should stop thinking about things in isolation. It's not what we can do for Palestine or what we can do around borders. It's what can we do around all of these questions together? How can we connect them? And how can we develop a language that makes us and others around us understand how these questions are related to each other?
Great, thank you so much. Thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to all the attendees for your time and patience, and apologies for the technical problems. But first of all, a big thank you to our interpreters, Izaskun and Erin, for almost 2 hours of interpretation. So thank you so much for staying with us, and big thank you to Apruva and Maren for the technical help. Thanks to all of you, and we are finishing with the invitation to the next webinars organized by Stop the Wall. The list you can find on the website of Stop the Wall and register there as well. So thank you so much, and we hope to see you in the near future, and let's continue to collaborate and continue the struggle.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.